The village of Dunmore had seen better days. It sat at the edge of the northern mountains, small and quiet, with maybe 200 people living in wooden houses behind a low stone wall. The people of Dunmore were farmers and traders. They kept goats, grew grain, and stayed out of trouble. They were not fighters. They had never needed to be. That changed the night the Ashclaw raiders came. The raiders swept through before anyone could react. They came on horseback, carrying torches, moving fast and loud through the dark. By the time the village men grabbed their tools and pitchforks, half the houses were already burning. People ran in every direction. Children screamed. The old stone wall, which had never been built to stop anything serious, did nothing at all. By morning, the raiders were gone. They had taken the grain stores, the livestock, and anything made of metal. They left behind ash, broken doors, and silence. Elder Bram walked through what remained of the village with a heavy chest and slow steps. He was an old man with white hair and a bent back, and he had led Dunmore for 30 years. He had seen hard winters and sickness and floods. He had never seen anything like this. 3 people had not survived the night. Among them was a young couple who lived near the east gate. They were found in the morning, still and cold. And beside them, wrapped in a wool blanket that had somehow stayed clean through all of it, was their baby boy. The baby was alive. He was very young, no more than a few weeks old. He had not yet been given a name in the village records. He lay in the blanket and cried softly, not understanding anything, only feeling cold and hungry and alone. Elder Bram picked him up and held him carefully. Around him, the other elders gathered. Nobody spoke for a long moment. Then Elder Bram looked up at the mountains. Everyone in Dunmore knew about Varathos. She had lived in the high caves above the valley for longer than anyone could remember. She was a dragon, fully grown, with dark scales the color of storm clouds and wings wide enough to block out the sun. People said she had destroyed a garrison of soldiers many years ago when they threatened her nest. People said her roar could shake stones loose from cliffs. People said she was the most dangerous creature in the entire northern region. Nobody went near her mountain. Nobody with any sense, anyway. But Elder Bram was a desperate man standing in the ruins of his village, holding a baby with no family and no future, and his mind was moving in a dark and terrible direction. There were old stories. Very old ones. Stories about offerings left at the caves of great dragons, tributes meant to buy peace and protection. Most people thought those stories were just that, stories. But Elder Bram was out of options, and desperate men reach for things they would never normally touch. He looked at the baby. Then he looked at the mountain again. The other elders understood what he was thinking. Some of them looked away. One of them, a woman named Elder Scylla, shook her head slowly. "You cannot be serious," she said. "We have nothing left," Elder Bram said quietly. "If the raiders come back, we are finished. We need protection. Real protection." "That creature will eat the child," Elder Scylla said. "Maybe," Elder Bram said. "Or maybe it will not come to that." He did not fully believe his own words. But he said them anyway, because there was nothing else to say. That afternoon, a small group of elders climbed the mountain trail. Elder Bram carried the baby. The others carried nothing, because there was nothing left worth carrying. The trail was steep and cold, and the wind blew hard off the peaks above them. Nobody spoke. The baby slept most of the way up, worn out from crying. They stopped at the wide flat shelf of rock just outside the cave entrance. The cave mouth was enormous, dark, and deep, and the smell coming from it was like hot stone and something older than fire. The ground around the entrance was marked with long scratches in the rock, made by claws. Elder Bram stepped forward and set the baby down on the flat rock. He wrapped the blanket more tightly around the small body. The baby stirred and made a quiet sound but did not wake. The elders stepped back. They moved to the tree line at the edge of the shelf and pressed themselves behind the trunks, watching. For a long time, nothing happened. Then the cave moved. Or rather, something inside it moved, and the darkness shifted, and then there were two eyes. They were gold, large and steady, glowing faintly in the shadow like two coins held up to a flame. They did not blink. They simply looked out at the flat rock and at the small bundle sitting on it. Then Varathos came out. She was enormous. Even having heard the stories, none of the elders were truly ready for how large she was. She moved slowly, which somehow made her more frightening, not less. Each step was deliberate and heavy and certain. Her dark scales caught the afternoon light and showed deep blues and greens beneath the gray. Her wings were folded close to her body. Her tail moved behind her like a slow current of water. She lowered her head when she reached the baby. The baby woke up. He opened his eyes and looked up at the massive face above him. He did not scream. He simply looked, the way very young babies sometimes look at things, without judgment, without fear, with complete and open attention. Varathos was still for a long moment. She breathed in slowly, reading the scent of the child with the same careful attention she had once given to her own eggs. And something happened inside her chest that she had not felt in a long time. It was not a soft feeling. It was deep and heavy and ancient, like a door opening in a part of her that had been shut since the volcanic fire took her nest. Since the heat that should have given life instead ended it, leaving her cave cold and silent and wrong. She looked at the child on the rock. She looked back at the dark trees where the humans were hiding. She had known they were there the entire time. Then she looked at the child again. Her front claw moved with extraordinary care. The same claw that had pinned soldiers to the ground and cracked stone walls moved gently, so gently, curling around the wrapped bundle on the rock. She lifted the baby the way she had once turned her eggs, with a precision that had nothing to do with size or strength and everything to do with intention. The baby made a small sound against her claw. His tiny hand found one of her dark scales and held on. Varathos turned and walked back into the cave. The elders stood behind the trees and did not move for a very long time. Elder Scylla had one hand over her mouth. Elder Bram was gripping the bark of the tree in front of him hard enough to hurt. The cave was quiet. The mountain was quiet. And somewhere deep inside the dark, a dragon mother held a human baby against the warmth of her chest, and the cold and terrible silence of her nest was no longer quite so empty. 3 weeks passed after the elders left the baby on the mountain. Nobody in Dunmore spoke about it openly. They went about their days, clearing ash, repairing walls, trying to put the raid behind them. But the baby was always somewhere in the back of their minds. Some of them felt guilty. Some of them told themselves it had been the only choice. Some of them simply tried not to think about it at all. Elder Bram thought about it every single day. On the 22nd morning, he called a quiet meeting with 2 of the other elders. He told them he needed to know. He needed someone to go up the mountain and find out what had happened. Not to interfere. Not to do anything. Just to look and come back and report. The elders looked at each other. Nobody volunteered. Then a young woman standing near the doorway spoke up. Her name was Mara. She was 23 years old, lean and quick, with dark hair she kept tied back and eyes that missed very little. She was not an elder. She had come to the meeting only because she had been helping carry water to the damaged houses nearby and had heard the voices through the open window. She was not supposed to be there. But she stepped forward anyway. "I will go," she said. Elder Bram looked at her for a moment. "You understand what might be up there," he said. "I understand," Mara said. "I will be careful." He did not argue. There was nobody else willing, and he needed to know. Mara left before midday. She took nothing with her except a small knife at her belt, more out of habit than any real belief it would help her against a dragon. She knew the mountain trail from summers spent gathering herbs on the lower slopes. She moved quietly and kept to the side of the path where the trees gave the most cover. The higher she climbed, the colder the air became. The wind carried that same smell she had heard the elders describe, hot stone and something old and deep. She slowed her steps as she neared the top of the trail. The flat shelf of rock outside the cave was empty. Mara crouched behind a boulder at the edge of the tree line and watched. She watched for a long time. The cave entrance was dark and still. No movement. No sound. Then she heard something. It was very faint. A low sound, coming from deep inside the cave. Not a growl. Not the sound she had expected. It was a rumble, slow and rhythmic, almost like the sound a large fire makes when it breathes steadily in a closed room. It rose and fell in a pattern that was almost, if she was honest with herself, musical. Mara stayed very still and listened. Then she heard something else. Underneath the rumble, softer and smaller, a human sound. A baby sound. Not crying. Something closer to the small contented noises a sleeping infant makes when it is warm and safe and completely unaware of anything difficult in the world. Mara stood up slowly from behind the boulder. She told herself later that she did not know why she walked toward the cave entrance instead of turning around and going back down the mountain with her information. She had what she came for. The baby was alive. That was the answer Elder Bram had sent her to find. But her feet carried her forward anyway. She stopped just inside the cave entrance where the darkness began. She waited for her eyes to adjust. Slowly, the inside of the cave took shape around her. It was large, much larger than it looked from outside. The walls were smooth in places, rough in others. The floor was covered in a deep layer of something soft, not leaves or grass, but shed scales, she realized, layered over time into something almost like bedding. And there, in the deepest and warmest part of the cave, was Varathos. The dragon was curled on her side, one great wing spread open and angled downward like a canopy. Tucked against her belly, wrapped in that same wool blanket from the village, was the baby. He was asleep. His small chest rose and fell steadily. His face was completely relaxed, the way babies look when they feel entirely safe. Varathos's golden eyes were open. She was looking directly at Mara. Mara stopped breathing for a moment. Every part of her body told her to run. She did not run. She stood completely still and met the dragon's gaze and did not move a single muscle. Varathos did not move either. She did not growl. She did not shift her position. She simply looked at Mara with those large steady eyes, and after a long moment, she lowered her head back down to the floor slowly, keeping the baby tucked close. It was, Mara understood, a kind of permission. Or at least the absence of a threat. She stood there for another minute, just watching. Then she backed out of the cave carefully, step by step, and did not turn around until she was well outside. She sat on the flat rock in the cold afternoon air and breathed. Then she started back down the mountain. What she had seen stayed with her the entire walk home. She delivered her report to Elder Bram in a quiet and careful voice, telling him exactly what she had found. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was silent for a very long time. "Alive," he said finally. "Healthy," Mara said. "Sleeping. Warm." Elder Bram sat down heavily in his chair and said nothing else. Up on the mountain, in the days and weeks that followed, Varathos was learning. She had raised hatchlings before. She knew how to keep them warm, how to read their sounds, how to tell the difference between a cry of hunger and a cry of fear. But hatchlings were not like this. This creature was softer and slower and far more fragile than anything she had ever cared for. He could not regulate his own warmth. He needed to be fed in a rhythm she had to learn by trial and attention. He cried in ways that at first all sounded the same to her and slowly, over days, began to carry distinct meanings she started to recognize. Hunger sounded different from cold. Cold sounded different from loneliness. Loneliness was the one she had not expected. The baby did not just need warmth and food. He needed presence. He needed to feel something alive nearby. When she shifted too far away in the night, he would wake and cry, and the crying would stop almost immediately when she moved close again and let the heat of her body reach him. She began sleeping curled completely around him. She kept her breathing slow and steady so the rhythm of it moved through the stone floor beneath him like something constant and safe. She hummed. She had not planned to. It simply happened one night when the baby was restless and would not settle. The sound came from deep in her chest, low and long, the way dragon mothers hum to eggs to help the hatchlings inside feel the vibration of a living thing nearby. It moved through her body and into the floor and up through the blanket and into the small creature curled against her. The baby went still. Then his breathing slowed. Then he slept. After that, she hummed every night. She learned that he liked it when she was close enough that he could feel her warmth without being pressed too tight. She learned that he slept longest in the early morning. She learned that when he was hungry he turned his head from side to side in a searching motion before he started to cry, and if she responded to that motion quickly enough, the crying never came at all. She was paying attention. She was always paying attention. One afternoon, about 5 weeks after she had carried him inside, the baby was awake and alert, lying against her side in a patch of warm light that came through a crack in the cave ceiling. He was looking up at her the way he often did, with that open and total attention that very young humans gave to things they found interesting. Varathos lowered her head close to him. The baby reached up. His small hand found the edge of one of her scales, a large one near her jaw, dark and smooth with age. His fingers closed around it with surprising grip. He held on, and then he laughed. It was a real laugh. Not a sound of contentment or relief. A laugh, bright and sudden and completely delighted, as if grabbing her scale was the finest thing that had ever happened to him. Varathos did not move. Something shifted in her chest in that moment. Something that had been careful and measured and held at a certain distance came loose all at once and settled into something else entirely. Something permanent. She had been caring for him because he needed care. Because her cave was empty and her instincts were old and strong and he had been placed in front of her at a moment when she had nothing left to protect. But this was different. This was not instinct. This was something she chose, right then, in that moment, while a tiny human hand held onto her scale and laughed at her. She thought of the old word. The one that meant a small fire that refuses to go out even in wind and cold. The one that meant something alive and warm in the dark. Kale. She would call him Kale. Captain Dorn had been hunting dragons for 11 years. He was not a cruel man. He did not enjoy killing. But he was very good at his work, and he took his contract seriously, and when the royal office handed him the file on Varathos with a sealed commission and the kingdom's stamp pressed into red wax, he read it carefully, packed his gear, and assembled his team without hesitation. The file was detailed. Varathos had destroyed a border garrison 7 years ago. 12 soldiers lost. 3 buildings burned to the foundation. The garrison had been threatening her nest at the time, a fact mentioned briefly in the report and then set aside, as official reports often did with inconvenient details. The crown wanted the threat eliminated. The northern settlements were expanding. A dragon controlling the high caves above the valley was not something the kingdom planned to work around indefinitely. Dorn selected 11 of his best men. They were experienced, well-armed, and calm under pressure. They carried crossbows fitted with bolts designed for heavy hide, short swords for close work, and 2 heavy nets lined with iron links. They also had a battle map of the mountain trail and notes on dragon behavior from the Royal Academy. What they did not have was any information about a human child. Nobody had told them. The elders of Dunmore had not sent word to the capital. Mara had not told anyone outside the village what she had seen. The knowledge of the baby on the mountain had stayed quietly inside Dunmore's walls, unspoken to outsiders, the way strange and delicate things sometimes stay inside small communities that do not fully trust the world beyond their borders. So Dorn's team climbed the mountain trail on a gray morning with complete confidence that they were walking toward a single dangerous dragon and nothing else. Mara saw them pass through the village before dawn. She had been awake early, as she often was, and she was standing near the well when she heard the sound of boots and equipment moving along the road. She counted them as they passed. 12 men, armed and organized, moving with the particular quiet focus of people who knew exactly where they were going. She knew immediately what they were. She did not stop to think. She left the well and ran for the hidden trail she had been using for months, the narrow path through the eastern trees that came up behind the cave shelf faster than the main trail. She was lighter and faster than 12 armed men, and she knew the path well enough to move quickly even in the gray early light. She reached the cave shelf ahead of them. She called out at the entrance, quietly but clearly, using the low tone she had learned. Varathos responded to without alarm. She did not go inside. She never went inside without invitation. But she spoke toward the darkness and said what she had seen, and she trusted that the dragon heard her. Then she pulled back to the tree line and waited. Inside the cave, Varathos had already smelled them. She had picked up their scent on the wind before Mara arrived, iron and leather and the particular oil used on hunting crossbow mechanisms. She knew what it meant. She had encountered hunters before. Not since Kale had come to live with her, but she remembered the smell well enough. She looked at Kale. He was 2 years old now, steady on his feet, curious about everything, and completely fearless in ways that sometimes made her chest tight with worry. He was sitting near the warm center of the cave stacking small stones into a pile with focused concentration. Varathos crossed the cave in 3 steps and picked him up. He made a sound of mild protest at being interrupted from his stones. She carried him to the back of the cave, to the deepest chamber, the one where the walls were thick and the air was warmest and no outside sound penetrated clearly. She had used this chamber to sleep during the hardest winter storms. It was the safest place she knew. She set him down on the soft layer of shed scales. She looked at him steadily. He looked back at her with his dark eyes, already learning to read her moods, already understanding that this look meant something serious. She touched her nose gently to his forehead. Then she turned and walked back toward the cave entrance. Dorn's team arrived at the flat shelf 7 minutes later. They spread out in the practiced formation they used for cave approaches, crossbows raised, 2 men on each side, Dorn in the center front. They moved to the entrance and stopped. The cave looked empty and dark. Then Varathos stepped forward out of the shadow and filled the entrance completely. Several of the men stepped back without meaning to. Even Dorn, who had faced 4 dragons in his career and survived all of them, felt the particular cold that moved through a person when something truly large and truly dangerous decided to give you its full attention. She did not roar. She did not breathe fire. She simply stood there and looked at them. Dorn steadied himself. "Hold positions," he said quietly to his men. He raised one hand in a signal and they stopped moving. He studied the dragon in front of him. She was larger than the file had suggested. Her dark scales were the color of deep water, and her gold eyes moved across his team with an intelligence that was uncomfortable to look at directly. She was reading them the same way he was reading her. "On my count," Dorn said quietly. He never finished the count. Varathos moved. She moved faster than something her size had any right to move, and she moved with a precision that was almost worse than speed. She did not go for any of the men. She went for their equipment. One sweep of her tail knocked 4 crossbows from 4 pairs of hands simultaneously. One foreleg came down on the iron net before the 2 men carrying it could deploy it, pinning it flat to the rock. She caught the bolt that one frightened man fired reflexively and held it between 2 claws, looked at it briefly, and set it down on the ground. The whole thing took less than 10 seconds. Nobody was hurt. Nobody was bleeding. But every weapon that could have done her serious damage was now on the ground, pinned, or out of reach. Dorn had not moved. He stood in the center of the shelf with his short sword still in its sheath and looked at the dragon who was now standing directly in front of him, close enough that he could feel the heat coming off her scales. She could kill him right now. They both knew it. She did not. She looked at him. Just looked. And Dorn looked back, and he was trying to understand what he was seeing in those gold eyes, because it was not what he expected. It was not rage. It was not the blank dangerous focus of an animal defending territory. It was something much more specific than that. Then he heard it. From somewhere deep inside the cave, a small voice called out. It was a child's voice, young and clear, saying a single word in a language that was half common tongue and half something else entirely, something low and rounded that did not belong to any human dialect Dorn had ever heard. But the meaning was plain enough. The word was mother. Dorn went completely still. He looked at the cave entrance. He looked back at Varathos. Her eyes had not moved from his face. She was watching him with that steady and total attention, waiting, it seemed, for him to understand. He understood. He took one slow step backward. Then he turned to his men, who were standing in various states of shock across the shelf, and he said two words in a very quiet and very careful voice. Stand down. Nobody argued. Nobody moved for a long moment. Then slowly, one by one, they lowered their hands and stepped back from their positions. Dorn looked at Varathos one more time. She had not moved. She stood at her cave entrance with the mountain wind moving around her and her gold eyes watching him, and from somewhere behind her in the warm dark, the small voice had gone quiet again. Dorn picked up his pack from the ground. He signaled his team toward the trail without another word. He had a report to write. He was already certain it was going to be the strangest report the royal office had ever received. 5 years passed quietly on the mountain. Quietly was perhaps not the right word. The mountain itself was never truly quiet, there was always wind, always the sound of stones settling deep in the rock, always the low rumble of Varathos moving through the cave or climbing to the high ridge to watch the valley below. But those sounds had become normal. They had become the sounds of home. Kale grew. He grew the way children do when they are well fed and well loved and have enormous amounts of space to move through, steadily and then suddenly, in small jumps that seemed to happen overnight. By the time he was 4 he was climbing the lower cave walls with his hands and feet, finding holds in the rock that Varathos watched him use with careful attention, ready to catch him if he fell. He never fell. He had his mother's sense of weight and balance, learned not from instruction but from years of watching how she moved through the world, deliberately, precisely, without wasted motion. By the time he was 6 he was running the mountain trails alone. Not the main trail that led down to the village. The smaller trails, the ones that wound through the upper rocks and the cold pine forest below the cave shelf. He knew every turn and every drop and every place where the path narrowed to almost nothing above a steep slope. He ran them in the early morning when the air was sharp and the light was new and the world smelled like cold stone and pine resin and the faint trace of smoke from Varathos's breath. He read the world mostly through smell. This was not something anyone had taught him. It had developed the way all his stranger qualities had developed, through proximity, through years of living beside a creature whose senses worked differently from a human's and whose way of understanding the world had quietly shaped his own. He could smell rain before the clouds arrived. He could smell strangers on the trail before he could see or hear them. He could smell the difference between a wolf moving through the lower forest and a deer, between fresh water and stagnant water, between a fire that was controlled and one that was beginning to spread. The villagers of Dunmore, on the rare occasions they saw him, did not quite know what to make of him. He looked like a normal boy. Dark-haired, lean, with quick eyes and a face that was still young enough to be open and unguarded. But he moved differently. He was too still when he was watching something. He tilted his head at sounds that other people did not seem to register. When he spoke, his voice was clear and his words were well chosen, but underneath the common tongue there was sometimes a faint resonance, a depth that did not belong in a child's voice, as if he had learned to speak in a register borrowed from something much larger than himself. The village children found him interesting and slightly unnerving in equal measure. Mara's role on the mountain had grown into something neither she nor the elders had planned. What had started as a single terrifying scouting mission had become, over 5 years, a steady and quiet routine. She climbed the mountain twice a week. She brought things the cave could not provide: cloth, dried food, soap, the small practical items that a growing human child needed and that a dragon cave did not naturally contain. She taught Kale to read from a book she had carried up the trail one afternoon on an impulse, and discovered that he learned faster than any child she had ever seen, absorbing words and their meanings with the same focused attention he gave to tracking animals across stone. She taught him numbers. She taught him the names of the villages in the valley and the names of the rivers and the rough shape of the kingdom's geography. She told him stories about human customs and human history, because she understood that he would need to understand the world below the mountain eventually, even if the mountain was where he belonged. Varathos watched all of this from a comfortable distance and said nothing. Which, Mara had learned, was how Varathos expressed approval. The dragon's protection of the valley had become something the village felt without fully understanding. The wolves that had been a serious problem for the farmers 3 years ago had disappeared from the lower pastures. A group of armed men who had been moving through the region, the advance scouts of a warlord testing the edges of the northern territories, had turned back suddenly after making camp one night below the mountain, packing up before dawn and leaving at speed without any clear explanation. A sickness that had moved through the eastern villages had stopped at Dunmore's border, perhaps by chance, perhaps not. The elders did not talk about these things directly. But Elder Bram, who was very old now and moved slowly and spent most of his days sitting near the fire, had taken to looking up at the mountain each morning with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite guilt and was probably some mixture of both. Mara did not tell the village everything she knew. She told them enough. It was on a cool morning in early autumn that Kale smelled the visitor on the trail. He was sitting on the flat rock outside the cave entrance, working through a reading exercise Mara had left with him, when the wind shifted and brought him something new. He set the book down and lifted his head and was still for a moment, sorting through the information the air was giving him. One person. A man. Older. Leather and iron, but not the sharp aggressive smell of a full hunting kit, one sword, maybe a knife, traveling light. Tired from the climb. Moving carefully, not trying to hide, which meant he was not trying to surprise anyone. Kale looked back into the cave. Varathos was already watching him from the entrance shadow with her gold eyes half open. She had smelled the visitor well before Kale had. She held his gaze for a moment, then lowered her head back to her resting position. She already knew. And she had not moved to intercept. That meant Kale should go. He put the book inside the cave entrance, straightened his jacket, and walked down the trail at an easy pace. He met Captain Dorn at the second bend, where the trail curved around a large boulder and opened up enough for 2 people to stand comfortably. Dorn had aged. His hair was more gray than brown now and there were lines around his eyes that had not been there 5 years ago. He was breathing harder than he would have liked from the climb and he was carrying a leather satchel over one shoulder and a sealed letter in his hand. He stopped when he saw the boy step around the boulder and stand in the middle of the trail, and for a moment he simply stared. He had seen the child once before, briefly, at a distance, in a dark cave 5 years ago. He had been maybe 2 years old then. He had not been ready for what 7 years old looked like on this particular child. Kale looked at him with calm dark eyes and waited. "I am looking for the dragon," Dorn said, because he did not know how else to start. "I know," Kale said. His voice was clear and steady and carried that faint unusual depth that made Dorn feel for a moment like the boy was considerably older than he appeared. "She already knows you are here." Dorn looked up the trail instinctively. She has known since you reached the lower pine forest, Kale said, without any particular emphasis, as if this were simply a fact about the weather. Dorn looked back at the boy. You live up there, he said. With her? Yes, Kale said. How long? Always, Kale said simply. Dorn was quiet for a moment. He looked at the sealed letter in his hand. It carried the royal stamp and had been pressed by the king's own council secretary. It was an important document by any measure. Holding it in front of this particular 7-year-old on this particular mountain trail, it felt suddenly much less significant than it had at the bottom. I have a letter, Dorn said. From the king's council. They are requesting that Varathos come before them. To answer for the garrison incident and to discuss the status of this territory. Kale listened to all of this without any change in his expression. I will bring it to her, he said. He held out his hand. Dorn looked at the small open hand in front of him. He looked at the royal seal on the letter. He thought about protocol and rank and the proper channels for royal correspondence. Then he placed the letter in the boy's hand. Kale looked at the seal for a moment, then looked back up at Dorn. You should rest before you go back down, he said. The afternoon wind on the lower trail is cold and you are tired from the climb. He paused. There is a flat rock around the next bend with good shelter from the wind. Mara uses it sometimes. Then he turned and walked back up the trail toward the cave, carrying the king's letter in one hand, easy and unhurried, as if delivering royal correspondence to a dragon mother was simply part of an ordinary morning. Dorn stood on the trail and watched him go. Then he went and found the flat rock and sat down and stared at the valley below for a long time, thinking about the report he was going to have to write, and how no one at the royal council was going to believe a single word of it. The royal council did not like Dorn's report. They read it twice. Then a senior advisor read it a third time out loud in the council chamber while the others sat around the long table and listened with expressions that moved gradually from skepticism to discomfort to something close to irritation. A dragon that had not attacked in 5 years. A human child living in the cave. A boy who had taken the king's letter from a royal hunter's hand as if collecting laundry. It was not the kind of report the council knew how to process. There was a long discussion. Several members argued that the situation was irrelevant, a contract had been issued, a dragon had avoided justice for a garrison attack, and the crown could not be seen to back down from its own commission simply because the circumstances were unusual. Others were more cautious. One older advisor mentioned the old Warden treaties, agreements made in the early years of the kingdom with powerful creatures of the northern reaches, arrangements that had kept the border territory stable for generations before someone decided they were no longer necessary. Nobody listened to that advisor for very long. In the end the council made the decision that councils often make when they are uncomfortable and impatient and do not fully understand what they are dealing with. They decided to send more force and expect the problem to resolve itself. 500 soldiers left the capital 12 days after Dorn submitted his report. They were commanded by General Hast, a broad and experienced military man who had organized 3 successful border campaigns and did not believe in complications. He had read Dorn's report and set it aside. He had a clear objective, a large force, and complete confidence that the situation would be handled efficiently. The army moved through the valley in a long column and made camp at the base of the mountain as the sun dropped behind the western peaks. They set up in organized rows, lit their fires, posted their watches, and prepared for a morning advance. Mara watched them arrive from the edge of the village. She had been watching the road since the morning, because she had heard from a trader 3 days ago that soldiers were moving north, and she had gone up the mountain immediately to tell Varathos. The dragon had listened without moving. Kale had sat beside her and listened too, his dark eyes steady and calm, and when Mara finished he had nodded once as if she had confirmed something he already understood. She had asked him what they were going to do. He had thought about it for a moment. Then he said they were going to do what was true. Mara had not fully understood that answer at the time. Standing at the village edge watching 500 campfires burn at the base of the mountain, she thought she was beginning to. She went back up the mountain that night. Several of the village elders followed her without being asked. Old Elder Bram came too, moving slowly with a walking stick, not saying anything to anyone, simply setting his feet on the trail and climbing. Nobody told them to come. Nobody told them not to. They came because the mountain had been protecting them for 5 years and they were not willing to stand in their houses and pretend they did not know that. They gathered on the cave shelf through the night. Varathos was aware of each of them. She did not come out. She stayed inside with Kale, and the cave was warm and quiet, and somewhere close to midnight Kale fell asleep against her side the way he always had, and she kept her breathing slow and steady and did not sleep at all. In the morning, General Hast assembled his force in the valley below and began the advance up the mountain trail. 500 soldiers on a mountain trail made a great deal of noise and took a considerable amount of time. Hast rode at the front on a gray horse, which was already showing signs of unease the higher they climbed. The air smelled different up here. The horse knew something the general was still deciding to ignore. They came around the last bend in the trail and the valley opened up below them and the cave shelf appeared above, and General Hast raised his hand and the column stopped. A boy was standing in the middle of the trail. He was perhaps 7 or 8 years old. He was lean and dark-haired and standing with his hands at his sides and his feet planted at shoulder width, and he was looking up at the general on his gray horse with an expression of complete and unhurried calm. He looked like he had been standing there for some time and was prepared to stand there considerably longer. Hast looked down at him. He looked back up at the cave shelf. He looked back down at the boy. "Move aside," he said. "No," Kale said. His voice was clear and carried easily over the sound of 500 soldiers breathing and shifting and the nervous movement of horses. "I have something to say first." Hast stared at him. In 30 years of military service nobody had ever said no to him quite so simply and quite so calmly. He did not know what to do with it for a moment. "Say it then," he said, because he also did not know what else to say. Kale looked at him steadily. "Varathos has protected this valley for 5 years," he said. "She has not asked for payment. She has not made demands. She has kept the wolves back and turned away the warlord scouts and kept this region safer than the Crown's own border forces have managed in the territories to the east." He paused for one moment. "She has done all of this because this is her home and the people here are her responsibility. The same reason anyone protects anything." The valley was very quiet. "She is not your enemy," Kale said. "She has never tried to be. But she will defend what is hers. And so will I." Hast opened his mouth. Then the mountain moved. It did not actually move. But that was what it felt like when Varathos descended from the cave shelf. She came down the rock face with a slow and absolute certainty, her dark wings spread slightly for balance, each step deliberate and heavy, and she landed in the trail directly behind Kale with a sound that moved through the ground and up through the boots of every soldier standing on that mountain. She did not roar. She did not breathe fire. She folded her wings and stood still. She was enormous. Even soldiers who had been told what to expect were not ready for the reality of her. She filled the width of the trail completely. Her gold eyes moved across the assembled force with calm and total attention and found every face in turn and held each one just long enough. Kale did not look back at her. He did not need to. He stood at the front of her shadow and kept his eyes on the general and did not move a single muscle. The gray horse stopped cooperating entirely. Hast controlled it with effort and looked at the dragon and the boy standing together in the trail and felt something he had not felt in a very long time in his military career. He felt uncertain. He looked at his soldiers. He saw it in them too, the shifted weight, the lowered weapons, the eyes moving between the dragon and the boy and the group of villagers standing quietly on the shelf above. An old man with a walking stick. A young woman with steady eyes. People who had climbed a mountain at dawn to stand near a dragon because they trusted her. No battle formation he had ever studied covered this. He made a decision. He turned to the rider at his right and spoke quietly. The rider nodded, pulled his horse around, and started back down the trail at speed toward the capital. Hast looked at Kale one more time. The boy looked back at him with those dark calm eyes and waited. We will wait for instruction from the council, Hast said stiffly. Kale nodded once. That is a good decision, he said, without any mockery in it at all. The army held its position in the valley for 19 days. They were long and cold and uneventful days. The soldiers made their camp and kept their watches and looked up at the mountain and saw nothing threatening and gradually, quietly, began to feel slightly foolish about the whole thing. On the 20th day a rider came from the capital carrying a sealed document. It was not a battle order. The royal council, after considerable argument and the persistent efforts of the older advisor who had mentioned the Warden treaties and who had apparently refused to stop mentioning them, had made a different decision. Dorn had been called back to give his account in person. Several border settlement leaders had submitted written statements about the stability of the Northern Valley region over the past 5 years. The numbers had been examined. The garrison incident had been reviewed in full context for what appeared to be the first time. The document that arrived on the 20th day was a royal decree. Varathos was named Warden of the Northern Reaches. The title carried formal recognition, a defined territory, and a standing agreement between the Crown and the Warden that replaced the old commission entirely. It was written in careful legal language that had clearly taken a team of council scribes several days to compose. At the bottom of the decree, in the section listing the Warden's recognized household, was a single additional line. It listed Kale. No family name, because he had none on record. Just Kale, Ward of Varathos, Warden of the Northern Reaches, recognized under Crown law. Mara read the decree aloud on the cave shelf that evening while the last of the autumn light came down through the peaks. The elders listened. Elder Bram sat on the flat rock with his walking stick across his knees and his eyes on the valley below. Kale sat against Varathos's side the way he had since he was an infant, her great wing angled above him like a roof, the warmth of her coming through his jacket and into his bones. He listened to Mara read his name at the bottom of the page. He looked up at Varathos. She was already looking at him. Her gold eyes were steady and warm and full of something that had no name in any human language but that he had understood completely for as long as he could remember. He leaned his head against her side. She lowered her chin to rest above him gently, the way she had done since the very first cold night she carried him into the cave, the way she had done 10,000 times since, the way she would do for as long as he needed her to. He was not dragon. She was not human. The decree said ward. The cave said something else entirely. It said son.